As students, you begin your journey into school, college, or university. You're excited, you're enthusiastic, you're elate. But equally, you're scared, worried, and anxious, all of which are completely normal emotions. How profound will these next few years be? Who knows? Because studying is an exploration of who you are, but more importantly, who you can be. However, let me ask you a question. How many of you can honestly say that you feel motivated, optimistic, or even passionate about your courses, education, careers, or even future? You are not alone. There are approximately 7.9 billion people on this planet, and out of those 7.9 billion people, take a wild guess as to how many students you think have been affected by the pandemic. Now, some of you may say hundreds, thousands, even millions. In fact, 1.5 billion students across the world have been affected by schools and universities closing. Now, although face-to-face learning is returning back to normal, the consequences of the pandemic continue to be detrimental to individuals' academic life, social experiences, and mental health, even today. During a recent speaking engagement I had with students, I had noticed many of them had one key feature in common, and that was they were not motivated in their education. And this is a recurring theme that has emerged. You sit down to revise, or you have a lecture to attend, or a project to complete, but all of a sudden you become too tired, too busy, too distracted, or just too disconnected. And since the pandemic, these behaviours have been amplified. Now, the implementation of remote learning assessments and placements have had a controversial outcome. As well as students being unable to interact with other peers and tutors, they're also being challenged with alternate assessment styles, to which a certain extent they weren't prepared for. And as if that's not enough, there's one other obstacle that students have to hurdle, and that is finding a job. Now, to understand as to why finding a job has become increasingly tough for students, you have to understand the other complications that the pandemic has caused to students. So let's go through some. Now, many of you will have online lectures, and for those of you who do, you could write a book listing the problems of online studying. From everyone's favourite, the technical difficulties, to misunderstanding the content. Now, from the outside perspective, that might not mean anything, but from a student's perspective, it changes everything. The last thing you want when you're trying to learn a new topic is being interrupted or being left more confused than when you began. Equally, remote learning provides another barrier, which is the reduction in face-to-face interactions. Now, simply looking at people's faces on a video call is not the same as reading facial expressions, body language, or tone, or feeling the unity of being involved in a classroom experience. And that's what university should be, an experience. Now that we've briefly discussed some of the complications that the pandemic has caused to students, let's go over the job element. Now, some of you have applied for jobs or will be applying for jobs. You know the typical job specifications: X number of years experience, experience in a particular field, excellent communication, and interpersonal skills. The bread and butter of job specifications. But what does that actually mean? Let's take them one by one. X number of years experience. Now, from the get-go, students are already at a disadvantage. Why? Because in many careers, you need the qualification in order to gain the experience. Now, throw COVID into the mix, employers are even more reluctant to hire the inexperienced. But let's not fixate on that, because we've got the next box that we may be able to tick: experience in a particular field. Now, the argument here is that courses provide placements, which is true, they do. But since the pandemic, some of these placements were removed or replaced. Again, you're cornered. You're limited in what kind of experience you can gather. But don't be hopeless, because you can tick the next two boxes, because this is what university should directly or indirectly refine. And that is excellent communication and interpersonal skills. Now, before I elaborate on this point, I want to tell you how, from a psychological perspective, we nurture communication and interpersonal skills in humans. So when we think, our processes are influenced by our interactions, communications, experience, expectations, amongst others. Now, these can then be articulated more concisely through two methods: The first is writing. Writing is essentially the same as thinking, but with the additional benefit of having more control over your thoughts. And funnily enough, what the universities make you do endlessly: written examinations, assessments, and research modules, all of which are forms of writing. Now moving on to point number 2, interaction with other individuals. Now this is vital, because interaction with other individuals allows us to comprehend what is acceptable and what is not, as well as knowing what is right and wrong. We rely on our social interactions to teach us that. As a very basic example, when you're in high school, it's not deemed acceptable to call your teacher by their first name. When you're in university, it's abnormal not calling your lecturer by their first name. We rely on our social interactions to teach us what is right and wrong. This is exactly why universities provide placement, research, and collaborative learning opportunities. Now, using that concept of how we nurture our communication and interpersonal skills, it's very obvious to understand why many of us have weaknesses in those skill sets after being isolated for so long. So the expectation that life should be as it was pre-COVID is baffling, more so for students. Hiding behind the screens has become the comfort. And coming back to face-to-face life is alien. Now, throughout this talk, I've discussed the most critical side effects of the pandemic. And in spite of all those challenges that you face, there has to be something that you can do, right? And there is. Here is how you can make the most of your experiences. First is find the positives in your personal experience. Now, everyone, regardless of their situation, has a unique experience to them. Now, your experience from an academic and personal perspective is your advantage. What you learn and extract from those experiences will build your overall character. Now, let me give you an example. Earlier, we discussed my involvement in a speaking engagement with students. And during that speaking engagement, I asked them one question. That question was, what does your course mean to you? I received 2 very different answers. The first was, it's just a qualification. The second was, it's an opportunity for our future. 2 very different answers, but one had a better motive behind it than the other. And that's the point. The way you view your challenges, setbacks, and differences will determine what lessons you take away from your experiences. Now moving on to point number 2, which is conducting independent research. Now, universities teach you how to do independent research, so I won't dwell on that. But when you conduct independent research, it does not have to be endless articles or papers. It can be anything that's important to you. Now, independent research can be anything that's important to you, from mental health tips to hunting for a job. So earlier we discussed the bread and butter job specifications, and many times we don't even tick those boxes. But that does not mean we cannot adapt our approach to the type of job we apply for based on our learning and experiences. We've never had to be more independent than we've had to be throughout this pandemic. So use that as your asset. Be independent and research everything, because this is what will build the foundations to keep you one step ahead. Now this relates on to my final point. Do not be afraid to openly discuss gaps in your knowledge and experience. Now, because as a wise person once said to me, you don't know what you don't know. Some employers will be somewhat unaware as to why you have gaps in your knowledge and experience. It's your duty and obligation to emphasize the reasons for those gaps. And this can be daunting because you're having to display your so-called vulnerabilities, but it's only by displaying those vulnerabilities that you can then portray your strengths, which relates back to point number 1. Find the positives in your personal experience, because this is where you can draw out your strengths. Now, there'll be many other students in your position or individuals in your position, and the only way you can gain that employer's trust is by using honesty over fallacy. Now, throughout your studies, you have been and will be challenged mentally, physically, and emotionally. A familiar feeling is being undermined because you're a student. It's not easy, especially after this pandemic. Things won't be perfect because we don't live in a movie. In reality, we create our own movie. And the best part about creating our own movie is that we're able to direct it, produce it, star in it, and at certain points, we're also the audience in it too. To put it plainly, despite all the chaos that you go through, It is as students you began your journey. It is as students you will continue your journey. And as students of life, you are in control of your journey. Thank you.